Open Doors monument was dedicated with song and celebration in a Holocaust memorial park near Tel Aviv. It celebrates how hundreds of Jews found safety in the Philippines, where leaders rose above intense pressure to comfort and house the persecuted, and who cast the tie-breaking vote that created the modern state of Israel. One of those responsible for this monument, his footprints chiseled into the marble, is Max Weissler, whose family crossed Russia and China to reach safety in Manila.
The president of the Philippines knew about what is happening to the Jews in Europe, and he offered them to come to settle in the Philippines.
Offers, like this one, were powerful documents. One brave woman used a letter promising her husband a job as a cigar maker to pull him out of the infamous Sachsenhausen concentration camp.
I had blonde hair. I looked like a real German, what they called a real German girl, right? And I went there, and I simply had a lot of nerve. I went to the gate and I said I was coming to pick up my husband. Nobody questioned me that, that he was a Jewish guy.
Martha's daughter Ursula was only 5 years old, but the Nazi terror that drove them to flee is still a vivid memory.
We lived in an apartment. I was in the crib still, and the SS came. I guess I was taking a nap. I woke up and my eye level was their boots, these shiny, shiny boots, and they were ripped open the closet, and I don't know what they were looking for, if they were looking for passports or whatever, but I remember screaming my head off.
Flight was difficult. Most nations refused to accept any more refugees.
European Jewry is really ground to dust between two big millstones. One is the hateful bestiality of Nazi Germany, and the other is the apathy of the governments of the world.
In the Philippines, reaction to Nazi brutality was quick and clear. More than 1,000 people attended a rally in Manila saying that Hitler had violated the inherent right of every man to freedom, life, and the pursuit of happiness. Paul McNutt, the American High Commissioner to the Philippines, called Jewish refugees helpless and persecuted wanderers with no place to lay their heads. Colonel Dwight Eisenhower, working with Douglas MacArthur to build the Filipino military, wrote in his diary, "Hitler's record with the Jews is as black as that of any barbarian of the Dark Ages." And to newly elected President Manuel Quezon, it was not a question of whether his country would help, but why other nations did not.
Other countries perhaps did not think it that important. I don't presume to say. But I know that Dad had the moral courage to do it because he believed in the sanctity of human life and the right of people to live life as they believe they should.
3 powerful men, but they needed others to make this policy succeed.
Athlete, scholar, movie star, they all appreciate a fine cigar.
Brothers from Cincinnati, the Frieders had come to the Philippines to buy cigars and stayed to make them.
In 1918, when they first went to the Orient, I mean, they were really young men going out into a land that no one really knew too well. I think when they first got to the Philippines, there were, I don't know how many Americans were there. I don't think there were 30 Jewish families there.
They took turns running the family business, each bringing their wives and children to the Pearl of the Orient for a 2-year tour of duty. While the children swam and played, the adults moved within the glittering social world of the Philippine elite. This nightly parade of dances, receptions, and card games had a serious purpose.
They could have just hung out and play poker and have a good time and dance the tango. But no, they had something in their hearts. And what was this something? They had a burning desire to do something good. And they all used their personal relationships to work it out.
The Frieder brothers created and ran Manila's Jewish Rescue Committee.
Number one, they were able to. They were in a position where they could talk to the right people. Number two, they saw what was happening, and they knew that somebody had to do something. So they did.
They felt, because they were one of the 50 American Jewish families there, that that was the role everybody had to play if you're lucky enough to be in the Philippines.
A plan was hammered out over games of poker, games played in the air-conditioned lobby of the Manila Hotel, on the front porch overlooking the Frieders' lush gardens.
We could hear what was going on the porch all the time. We could hear when someone brought food out to them or drinks out to them, but they were playing poker out there.
And at the home of Angel Zervoulikis, a Greek-American private investigator.
But this kind of poker, where the Frieder brothers come to, they come out looking like they've smoked a lot of cigars. They sure smell like it, though. And then they're all talking. Yes, somebody's going to be happy. They'll be happy people.
Paul McNutt's monogrammed chips may have been on the table, but according to 12-year-old Olga, the real stakes were life and death. Alex Frieder suggested that the Philippines grant U.S. visas to Jewish refugees. Paul McNutt saw his point and raised the question of whether the Frieders could find them housing, food, and jobs. Dwight Eisenhower stood on the need to thwart the rising power of the Nazis. But perhaps President Quezon showed the highest cards when he said simply, "It's the right thing to do." In the end, a deal made over poker, bourbon, and cigars would mean escape for over 1,300 European Jews.
Most Filipinos are familiar with Schindler's List. And in Japan, the Japanese are also aware that there was a Japanese counterpart to Schindler. Very few Filipinos know that Quezon was in his own way a kind of Schindler.
Saying that Filipinos would be glad that when the time of need came, their country was willing to extend a hand of welcome, Quezon opened his country and even a portion of Marikina, his private estate, to the desperate refugees.
Marikina Hall was actually property that he had bought that was supposed to be the nest egg for my father. It was going to be the land that would make sure that my father would have a good living after his father was president. This is what he devoted for the place that the refugees could stay in.
Paul McNutt put his political career in jeopardy, demanding visas from a recalcitrant State Department.
In terms of helping Jews, he understood very well intolerance in American life and intolerance in American politics.
And the Frieders worked endless hours to make it all work.
When I came home from school at noontime, we were supposed to pick up my father and come home for lunch. But he was never ready because he was working on the list. The President Quezon had stipulated that he didn't want anybody that would be a burden on the economy. And so the Jewish community had to promise that they would take care of them, which they did.
It would be much simpler to understand, okay, the Frieders somehow put up money and figured out a way to get visas and did it. Or simpler to understand Quezon somehow acting on his own, having this epiphany of helping somebody and, doing it. But the fact that, he is a Catholic and McNutt is a Protestant and the Frieders as Jews come together, make it even more rich and interesting and incredible that it happened.
The poker players tried to do more, to provide sanctuary for thousands more refugees on the island of Mindanao. But the Japanese bombed Manila only hours after Pearl Harbor, the beginning of years of harsh occupation.
We were there for the death march when the Americans came through the streets. We were kind of peering out the window. And it was horrible. It was just people dragging along the street, marching along with the Japanese guards on either side.
It We went through some very hard times there in the Philippines. There was no picnic there. But as you see, we survived. You can make a lot of things go that you normally think you can do.
And despite a fanatic Japanese defense of the city against advancing American troops, a defense that rivaled any battle in World War II, over 1,000 refugees did survive. Manuel Quezon died before his country was liberated, but the link to Jewish freedom was not forgotten. In 1947, the Philippines was the only country in Asia to vote for the partition of Palestine, leading to the creation of the State of Israel. After the end of the fighting, the Manila Symphony, under Austrian refugee Herbert Zipper, played Beethoven in the ruins of a Catholic cathedral. Temple Emil, Manila's only synagogue, had been destroyed by the Japanese, but thousands of Jewish soldiers and refugees were welcomed by cantor Joseph Cisner, a refugee from Poland, for Passover, and eventually Rosh Hashanah in Manila's racetrack and baseball stadium.
It was a wonderful experience. It brought to mind at that time that we were really free. And to this day, when I attend a Seder, as I try to every year, I'm always reminded of that.
The boy who had asked the 4 questions was 10-year-old George Lowenstein from Germany, whose footprints are also set into the marble before the open doors of the Philippines.